Welcome to the Tending Our Nets podcast, where we believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We encourage everyone to learn more. We work to equip believers to share their faith with everyone they know.
Welcome to the Tending Our Nets podcast. My name is Joshua Sherman, and I am your host here. Today, we are going to be talking about the old gospel. This is something that Paul points out. This is something that we see pointed out in Hebrews 12, as it's talking about people who lived by faith and what that actually means, kind of the hall of fame of the faithful, if you will. And it's interesting. One of the things that I think is really challenging when we look at Christian theology is that you really kind of have to either decide that you see multiple gospels in the text, or you start looking at them and you realize they're really the same. That what we see is essentially continuing progressive revelation, more specific revelation of how God is restoring all things. So this is the old version of the gospel. This is where we see that after the flood, when people gather at the Tower of Babel and they decide, you know what, we're going to build this tower. We're going to bring God down to us. We're going to ascend to the heavens. We're going to kind of make God do our bidding is essentially what they're trying to do. God says no. He scatters them. He confuses their language. Right? And after that event, this is when God chooses to make a nation for himself. So he scatters 70 nations, or 72, depending on whether you're looking at the Hebrew or Greek Old Testament. He scatters these nations, and then he says, you know what? I don't want any of those. I'm going to make one for myself. So he chooses Abraham, and he chooses Abraham to be the father of the nation of Israel. God chooses Israel as his portion, his inheritance, through which he is going to bless all of the families of the earth. Abraham was considered righteous by faith, and that is how we are considered righteous, by faith in Jesus. And so you can kind of see some of these old pieces of the gospel set up right here in the Old Testament, early on in the book of Genesis. And then you actually have a place in Galatians, I believe it's Galatians 3, where Paul talks about this, and he says, understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham, are part of Israel. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announced the gospel, this good news, in advance to Abraham. Now listen to this. This is what Paul describes as the gospel that God spoke to Abraham. He says, all nations will be blessed through you. And so Paul goes on to say, those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So we don't see any particular mention of Jesus. We don't see anything that says, he's going to go to the cross, he's going to raise from the dead. That's how God's going to bring about the restoration of all things. But this is what Paul says is the gospel that God announced to Abraham. And actually, if we look at the story of the Bible, thinking about that big picture story we were just talking about, we see this in a lot of places. That God is continually working to bring about restoration in his creation, to bring about restoration among people. Here we see it with Abraham and Israel. And then in the New Testament, we pivot and we see that Israel had not really done their job well. They'd gone into exile a couple of times. They'd come back, and then they focused on themselves. They were supposed to be the light of the world, and they weren't. because they were trying to keep themselves pure from the world. They separated from the world, and they no longer could be the light and the salt that they were called to be. And then we see this progress, and then Jesus, right? Jesus as the new Israel. That's the way that the Gospel of Matthew really poses him. Jesus as the firstborn, right? Jesus as the seed of Abraham, through which all of these promises would come true. Right? So we can see in the Old Testament, Abraham thought Isaac is his seed. That is the child of promise. But as we go further on in the story, we realize that, yes, that was the child of promise, but there's still a child of promise yet to come. There is still a seed that will bring about what God promised to Abraham, that all nations of the earth will be blessed through you, or all families is another way that's actually put. So this is the gospel in the Old Testament, the good news that God would include not just Jews, but Gentiles as well, in his family by faith. Of course, that faith needs to be placed in Jesus. Now that we know what he did, who he is, that is where our faith needs to be. But we see that good news even as far back as Genesis 12. And actually as far back as Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So thank you for tuning in today. Next time we're going to talk more about, let's see. We're going to talk more about kind of that big picture gospel, more about that Old Testament gospel, and get to see just a picture of what God does through Jesus. It's pretty amazing. Go ahead and like and subscribe and give reviews and share with your friends. Let's get the word out so that we can help Christians share their faith effectively with everyone they know. You've been listening to the Tending Our Nets podcast. If you like what you hear, check us out at the Raven Creek Social Club and by searching for us on social media via Tending Our Nets.
Raise us up to